can survive if I let you.
Cultivating nevermore.
Let the new era begin. The era of the ECW.
Oh my God! This is extreme. Greetings, ECW fans, and welcome to This is Extreme, the ECW History Podcast. I am your host, Dave Dynasty. Thank you for joining us for another fun episode. This episode, we have John Lister on. He is the author of the book, Turning the Tables, The Story of Extreme Championship Wrestling, unauthorized and uncensored. It is the first, to my knowledge, the first book published about ECW. It's a fun book, a fun read. I highly advise you to go pick up a copy. But I had a nice chat with John, talking about the book, talking about his process, talking about how the project came to be, and then just talking some general memories of ECW in general. John made some trips, right? He's from the UK. He did make some trips to the US. He has, he attended the ECW arena. He has done some things, and we talk all about those. Before we get into that, make sure you follow me and the podcast on social media. You can follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. Just look up ECW Pod. Once again, the X account is still locked. I don't know. I think it's gone. I think it's lost. So what you can do is on X, follow me at the Dave Dynasty. I still will make all those posts there on my account. So follow us there. Make sure you go and get the This is Extreme shirt. Just go to tinyurl.com/ECW pod shirt and buy one of those and support the show. Whatever podcast platform that you choose to listen to your shows on, please make sure you subscribe to us there. And if the option is available, make sure you give us a rating and a review, because that helps us in those algorithms. When other people are listening to shows, we come up as a suggested listen. Okay, let's take a really quick break here. Let's get right down to it. Come back with my discussion with John Lister, so stick around. Be sure to follow This is Extreme on all social media platforms. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for ECW Pod. Be sure to follow us, keep up to date, and join in the discussions. We want to hear your feedback, so find us on all the social media platforms and join the revolution. This is Extreme. And welcome back to This is Extreme. At this time, I am being joined by author John Lister, who wrote the book Turning the Tables, The Story of Extreme Championship Wrestling. John, how are you?
I'm doing very well, and thanks very much for having me here.
Absolutely. So, obviously, people might be able to tell, you're from the UK, correct?
That's right, yes. With ECW is very much even more of an underground thing here than it was in the States at the time, but the tape trading community was big fans of it, and also Power Slam magazine, which was a newsstand wrestling magazine here, always looking out for sort of colour photos for stories. And they struck gold with a guy called George Tahinos, who was based in New Jersey and regularly used to go into the ECW arena shows, and would have a client in the UK who was very glad to use his photos. And of course, being ECW, they tended to be quite dramatic, eye-catching photos.
So is that how you first, noticed ECW was in the magazines?
Yeah, I was sort of through the tape trading scene as well. This was the mid-90s, and ECW was sort of very popular. And I was lucky enough to live quite close to one of the main tape traders in the UK, a guy called Rob Butcher. And I was at university at the time, and in the UK, Wednesday afternoons at universities, there's always no lectures or sort of seminars or anything, because it's kept free. The idea is you're meant to go and play sports and to take part in athletic events. So my athletic event was going around Rob's house and watching the latest ECW tape every Wednesday afternoon.
Oh, that's, athletics by osmosis. That works. So tell me, were you already a wrestling fan at this time?
Yeah, so I was a wrestling fan. I'd watched it on and off from the kind of the mid-80s when it was the British promotions on TV over here. And then in 1989, I started watching WWF and became sort of a avid fan from there. It was kind of my parents always said it was like the fad that stuck with me. It's a bit like when the wind changes and your face stays that way. It was like, I had all fads as a kid. I was into, your war gaming. I was into soccer, football. And then, when wrestling came along, it really just kind of stuck. And, it's more than 35 years later, still a fan.
Yeah. So obviously here in the States, ECW, when it really caught on and people noticed it really, like you said, it was kind of this underground phenom, right? Because they really had their finger on the pulse of like pop culture, whether it be music or whatnot. Was that kind of the same thing in the UK? Did you feel that, hey, this is a little more representative of what the youth are into?
Yeah, and possibly even more because, the music in ECW tended to be things that have been quite popular, a year or two earlier. So, of course, the UK in some ways being a little bit behind at that time with culture was a bit slow to spread. It tended to be very popular. So, the idea that you could tune in and actually see like real music and videos with like real music intercut with the actual music videos you recognise, that was definitely very much part of it. Feeling like this is kind of aimed at adults and sort of older teenagers rather than just children, which was very much both WWF and WCW were kind of going for at the time.
Yeah, I agree. And like I said, you wrote this book. You got other books. What's your background as a writer? Were you already writing? Is that already something you had an interest in?
Yeah, I mean, I always, as long as I can remember, wanted to be a journalist of some kind. And the first wrestling material that I wrote was for I guess you'd call it a fanzine, but it was not sold by mail order. It was actually sold in shops, but just in the town where we lived. So it was a few kids in the local town who were a few years older than me who were at university at the time. I was about 14. And we'd actually take it to sort of news agents and newsstands around the town we lived in and get them to sell it. And we always like to say we factually were outselling the WWF magazine, but only within a 3-mile radius.
Well, I mean, however you have to spin the demographics, it works. I mean, it's funny because there was so much stuff like that with fans at that time, right? Pre-internet, and it's I always said it's kind of the same thing now. It's just you have a different avenue of delivering the product, right? It's there are still people who are writing in a quote unquote fanzine fashion. They just now deliver it, whether it be a blog, a website, or a video blog on YouTube or whatever it is. People always talk about how much things change, and it's to some degree, but it's more the technology part, the delivery side that's changed more than anything.
And I think in a way that process works in reverse because people always say, all right, wrestling fans today, all they do is say they sit there on their Twitter and they have flame wars and they just get into arguments with each other. Well, we used to do that with the British fanzine things. You'd make your point and somebody would argue it back and you'd argue back. The only thing was, between each person making their point, you had to wait a month for the letters to go in and appear in the next issue. So it kind of gave you a bit more time to, reflect on the point you were making.
Yeah, I mean, I remember getting in very heated discussions on the playground or in class or whatever about who the next champion was going to be or who was going to win what match. It was the same thing. We just didn't have social media. We were doing it face to face on the playgrounds. So as a writer, right, you're like you said, writing some fanzine type things and had this interest. When did you decide that, hey, I want to write this book about the history of ECW? How did that strike you?
So after I sort of graduated from university, I worked in public relations and journalism for about 5 or 6 years, and then sort of left from there to become a freelance writer. The first thing I did after that, I was kind of had this time in my hands, so I put together a compilation of a lot of articles that I'd written for my own fanzine and sort of other magazines before, which was called Slamphology, and that's also got a lot of sort of travel stories really of the first 3 times I went to the United States to watch wrestling, which included the first trip was to an ECW convention. After kind of getting to grips with the mechanics of publishing the book and sort of putting it together, I thought, well, I'd like to do a topic, do a book completely from scratch, and thought, what's something that I know a good bit about and the kind of thing that is a big enough subject to cover, in a full length book, but not so big and so kind of in depth that you can't possibly sort of do it justice in a book. And also something that's going to attract the attention of kind of readers and be of interest. And this was beginning of 2005, I started writing this, and finally published it, I think, in sort of the October or the November, but really kind of struck gold because right in the middle of this process was the WWF having the idea to do the One Night Stand show, and of course the alternate independent version of the Hardcore Homecoming. So that really kind of got a lot of people interested, and people sort of hadn't seen ECW but watched One Night Stand, were quite interested in, you know, what's kind of a history of this. So I think that really helped the book catch on.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I can gather, what I've seen, I have quite the book library, so I looked through all this. You were the first to publish a book about the history of ECW that I can tell.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of other books which followed on. There's the official WWF version, which was kind of the book based on the DVD, which had come out the previous year. And then there's Scott Williams put together one, which I think was published the end of 2006, because I think he covered some of the sort of WWF, the sci-fi, the bringing back the weekly TV. But mine was definitely the first dedicated book on ECW to be published. And I think by being it was a self-published book, that kind of gave me the big advantage of being able to kind of get it out there kind of straight away and sort of be first in that marketplace.
Yeah, and you mentioned, so really briefly, you mentioned Slamthology, and like you said, it talks about some of your trips to America, and one of them was ECW related. Tell us about that trip. When was that?
So that was August of '96, and at this time, twice a year, there's a guy called Tom Misnick, who was sort of known online as Mr. ECW, who would organise an internet convention. So it would be tied in with a weekend where there'd be a sort of spot show on a Friday night and ECW in on the Saturday. And you kind of book it so you could get tickets through him, you could get reserved seats, which was something, you know, you really needed to do it at this point, because otherwise you were going to be standing at the back trying to desperately kind of fit in somewhere. And then there'd be a couple of sort of suites in the hotel that would be kind of reserved for a tape watching during the day. And then usually the Saturday would have a question and answer session with various sorts of ECW roster members, you know, management. Paul Heyman, Todd Gordon would both be there. So this kind of was the first time I went over to go to these two events. I saw the sort of screenshot recently. You can see where I'm standing at one end. I'd been asked to hold up this sign, which said "Bubba must die," because at this point, this was summer of 1996. Bubba Ray Dudley was still the babyface Dudley. Devon was the recently brought in his sort of heel brother. And the fans at this point were totally fed up with the whole Dudley gimmick. They thought it was overblown. It was not going to last anymore. So they thought, if you hold up this sign, it's going to get the message through, and that'll be the end of the thing. I think, of course, what actually happened was they took that as a sign: we need to turn Bubba heel because the fans don't like him. And it's probably fair to say that extended the longevity of the gimmick quite a bit.
Yeah.
But the other end of this sign, holding up this sign, is Brian Last, who of course now Jim Cornette's partner. And somebody recently pointed out to us, sort of 2 seats in front of there is a 13 or 14-year-old Tony Khan.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask him that when you brought that up, because I've heard Brian Last tell that story about the Bubba Must Die, the big, what was it? Was it a bed sheet? Or it was very large, right?
Yeah, it was literally it was literally a bed sheet. I don't know, you know, couldn't say for certain. It was acquired from the hotel the convention was at, but yeah, that was it.
Yeah, that's funny. I've heard him tell that story, and so you were opposite end. Was that just by happen chance where you were? Had you met Brian at this convention?
No, I actually didn't know about this until I did a podcast with Brian, possibly 15 years or so later. And happened to, you know, mention this and realised that it was, you know, his sign. We just happened to be far enough along to help hold it up, because luckily we knew through George Tahinos, we were able to get into the building earlier than kind of the people who'd been bussed over for the convention, which meant we were able to get seats at the back row of the bleachers, which was great viewing experience. Like I say, you had to be there, you know, hours early to get those spots. It was potentially quite dangerous when the wrestlers were brawling in the crowd, because there was a good chance you were going to have to jump off the back, and it was, you know, 6 feet or so down. So you had to be quite careful. But yeah, it was an amazing experience. I think the thing that always struck me was that you were there having been in the afternoon, you'd had both Shane Douglas and separately the pit bulls talking about the injury to one of the pit bulls, which had just happened the show earlier, and they're talking about how it obviously is an accident, how bad it is when kind of things happen, and it's like something you sort of think to yourself, do we work this into the storyline? And then kind of you go to the show, and the doors aren't officially open, but a lot of the fans are kind of already in there. And there's wrestlers in the ring, working out, and people who'd been in a match the day before were sort of in there, shaking hands, talking to each other, working through spots in front of quite a lot of the fans. And you think this is breaking every rule there is. But then during the show, when they had Shane Douglas against the Pitbull 1, who was, or Pitbull 2 rather, whose partner had been severely injured and was in this neck race, it was the most genuinely heated match I'd ever seen. It was just the amazing ability, and I think the realization of going to ECW Live was that a lot of what you thought of, there's no baby faces in the heels, and the crowds, they're just like they're not into supporting one side or the other, was just complete nonsense. Nearly every match was some form of babyface heel, and the crowd were, even if it was deliberately suspending disbelief, they were really willing to kind of get caught up with it and generally sort of live or die by whether the baby faces won.
Yeah, I've always said, obviously ECW is so influential for so many ways, but one of the things is they were the first to embrace the smart fan, right? They knew, hey, this is, like it or not, this is here. This is what it is. These people, these fans they're informed that they live and die for this stuff. So they said, let's use it, and they would, they would at times attempt to work the smart fan, and sometimes would do it, and. But like I said, they embraced that. And I think that's one of the more trend-setting things they did for wrestling, is to realize, hey, this is happening. This is only going to get bigger and worse. Whether we like it or not, let's accept it and use it.
I think, again, it was this really interesting kind of crossover period, because as you say, they were kind of the harbinger of a lot of the future of the style of wrestling, the style of appealing to the fans. Certainly, anytime you see people that I'm a WWE loyalist, I hate AEW, or I'm an AEW loyalist, I hate TNA. I think ECW really was the first kind of promotion where the idea was, you would be a fan of the brand, a fan of the promotion as much as of any individual wrestler, and kind of there was this. The biggest feud in ECW was ECW against the WWF and the WCW.
Yep.
Even when they may have actually been working together behind the scenes in many ways. And I always likened it to getting onto pay-per-view was ECW winning the world title. And you had the thing of what do you do when you have a world title, and a lot of guys kind of lose steam. I think in a way that happened to ECW. But then going back, in a way, they were the last of the old territory system. So it was... particularly at the arena, it was around about 1,000 or so in this building every 3 weeks, running regularly. So you were still having to use a lot of the old kind of promotional tactics and approaches of keeping the crowd there, kind of building up from show to show, having the storylines, wanting to give the crowd something satisfied so they stay invested, but not giving them so much, not beating all the heels all the time, so there's no interest in coming back. And it's kind of really that crossover of, I feel like, Smoky Mountain, which ended at the end of '95, was like the last full-time territory, and then ECW was kind of like really that bridge between the territory independent scene and kind of the future of not necessarily being based entirely in a particular area, but kind of appealing to fans around the world. And being a sort of, a third national promotion in a way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like I said, I've talked to Todd Gordon and some others, and they, Todd has kind of held to the fact that when they started to overstep, that was kind of the first step to the end, right? When they tried to, it's like financially tried to expand into Florida and on the Sunshine Network and different things like that. While yes, it seemed great. There was a lot of money going out without so much coming back, right? Without the return, and then even pay-per-view, as great as it sounded, he always said, "Hey, I don't know if we're ready for that." and it was almost like you always hear ECW they were too big to be small and not too small to be big, and they were caught in this weird thing and kind of a victim of their own circumstance. I mean, do you feel that's true?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of concluded at the end of the book, really, after going through kind of all of the business aspects of it, really, that basically once you go past the point of, a small indie, which is, we're going to draw what we can, it'll be a few hundred fans, we'll draw however many hundreds or thousands of dollars we get, and then our job is to make sure we spend less from that so that we make a profit in the same business. Once you get past that and you start growing, I think really basically they were dead, and it was just a case of when it would happen. And really, it's not so much a case of whether they were in the long run profitable or making a loss. It was about the cash flow that eventually kind of did for them, and kind of decided when they got to the point where it got out of hand. Because as they kept growing, they had to keep growing. There was always some step they would have to take. They would have to run more shows so they could afford to give people more time, more work, so that they could not have to go and work a part-time job, or eventually had to start getting onto pay-per-view to keep people from going to WWF and WCW and getting the full-time contracts there. And then you kind of had to go to national TV to get the money there, to get the exposure, to get the sponsorship deals. And the problem was, every step in this case, the money you had to spend out was going out straight away. The money coming in for it was coming down the line. And you kind of got to the case, I think eventually was the TNN deal, which was, nowadays you get a TV deal, you're getting paid for it, you're golden. At this point, it was such a terrible deal that they had to sign because it was the only way they could keep expanding. But they would have had to dramatically increase their live business and their sponsorship money, which they did increase it a lot. But it was never at the rate to catch up. And the same with the pay-per-view. There's so many upfront costs. And a lot of the time for a smaller company on pay-per-view at the time, the problem would be you'd be getting, say, a 50-50 split. But how it would work would be the first 50,000 buys, all the money would go to the pay-per-view companies. For the next 50,000, you were getting all that money. And then once you were over 100,000, you were just getting a 50% of the money. So the problem was, until you kind of reach that level of buys, and B, they'd all been counted, and you confirmed we have got this total of more than this amount of money, so it's your turn to start getting your share of the money. That's an absolute killer for cash flow. And of course, the fact that it's no secret that the for behind the scenes accounting was not quite at the professional level it should have been. You've got kind of the very much the Jim Crockett kind of thing where by the time you realise you need to cut back on the money, it's kind of too late.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always fascinated about the process of historians and writers, and like I said, you've written several books. So when you commit to a project such as this ECW book, so where do you start? What is your first step in working on this project?
So with this one, this is probably not how I would do it today, but I kind of realised quite early it was not going to be practical in 2005 to be a book kind of based around interviews, which was primarily because at that point, being the base in the UK, there was sort of the time zone differences, but you didn't have your Skype or your Zooms and things, so it would have been entirely on phone calls, and just that wouldn't have been financially practical. Plus, at the same time, I guess maybe there's kind of thing of, I don't want to interview people and kind of have them lie to me. And also, it was still really the later kind of period of the time of, wrestlers don't talk openly to kind of journalists. Still, Foley's book was still only a few years old. So the idea of kind of wrestling books being kind of respectable and, serious books rather than kind of like completely in storyline wasn't there. So I kind of went about it I think I spent about 6 weeks of let's just gather together every piece of information I can about ECW from as many sources as I can, whether it's, newsletters from the time, reports, whether it's from tapes, whether it's some kind of shoot interviews. And then there's a lot of filtering out of, can I trust this particular source, what they're saying here? And think one really good thing there is either if you're talking to them, ask questions, or if you're kind of looking at somebody else's interview, kind of look through for things that you know factually, check that they're sort of saying the right things there, so that you know that they're generally being honest. And then like things that you don't know, but you're kind of taking it on their word, you can be more trustworthy about. And then it's kind of, are you getting multiple sources kind of confirming the same thing? And then it was more kind of working out how am I going to kind of arrange this. And it's kind of, it's not going to be just a straight chronology. So it's going to be kind of half moving through the time periods, but also kind of organizing things kind of logically into, starting off looking at what made Philadelphia so special, then kind of looking at kind of the expansion of the TV network. And kind of, I kind of then found, not intentionally, but it just made sense, but pretty much the first half of the book is much more about the in-ring product kind of expansion, how they appeal to the fans, with like a little bit about the business. And once you get to about Barely Legal, which is kind of the midpoint of the book, after that, the in-ring becomes kind of less of a focus, and it's much more about the business as they're actually trying to become sort of a full-time national promotion. And then just say looking through for a few spots to kind of break up the sort of chronological narrative, and kind of there's one chapter where I just focus entirely on the Raven Dreamer feud, and kind of look through kind of how that was booked, and then be like a little bit to just break it up where it's just like some classic Joel Gertner of the offensive lines, which was the one chapter I really hope my mother didn't read when she had a look through the book.
Yeah.
And then from there, it's just a case of going over to, many rewrites and re-edits to kind of get it as tight as possible. Because with the publisher that I was using, the book was printed on demand, so the cost was going to be very dependent on the page count. So I had to sort of get it in at a tight page count while still being as comprehensive and not missing anything important out, but not having too much fluff.
Yeah, with a lot of the research that I've done, I'm a bit obsessive, right? I want the thoroughness. I want to know everything, and one thing I've always struggled to do is to know when to stop, right? When to just say that's either lost the time. There's just no information there, nothing I can fill this hole with. It is what it is. I've always struggled with that fear of, okay, if you move on, something will come out and then you'll miss it or whatever. How do you know when to do that when you're researching something or gathering information, whether it be like maybe a specific topic for the book, to know when just to say, okay, that's it. I've got what I can get. This is good. How is there a way that you know when to say, okay, this is it, stop here?
I think it's really kind of when you think, so how would I boil down and explain this to somebody? And when you get to a point where you've got too much information to be able to still be able to boil it down to kind of what are the most important points, what's kind of the lesson and the trend here. I think ECW made a good topic for a book like that because, as I say, it's big enough to be covered in the length of the book, but it's something that it was largely completely documented. So pretty much every ECW result from every show is out there, has been recorded by people at the time, whether through the newsletters or through websites later, which meant you could look through and say, genuinely see how many shows they were running at different times, how long people were in for, what kind of patterns there were in kind of the booking and the business. And I think that made it kind of quite manageable. In contrast to, if you tried to do the history of the WWF the same way, you would have, many, thousands and thousands of shows. You wouldn't know where to start. And then going back, you get to a point where there's things that, just aren't documented, because particularly when it's not a kind of a mainstream media kind of topic. So I think it's just kind of keeping that focus of remembering that you're telling a story, and kind of every fact that you put in a book has to be there to kind of support the argument, to make the point, to kind of illustrate the big story, rather than it just turning into, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And you kind of read through and it's like, you've given me a lot of information, but I've not really kind of had a message. I'm not really kind of learnt anything from this.
Yeah. On the back of the book, you say that you discovered a little known truth about one of the most famous ECW feuds. I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're speaking of the Raven Dreamer feud.
That's great. Yeah. So and that's really a good example, I think, of one of the things that I found most useful of going back through old reports, old newsletter articles. That there was a lot of information that that piece was known at the time. It was not secret. But when you go back and you look at it in the context of knowing what came later, you realise these things linked together. These were quite interesting. This may have influenced something going on. A lot of that was to do with kind of the business side. But yeah, it was finding out that a couple of months into the feud, that Tommy Dreamer actually won a clean pinfall over Raven on a spot show. And that was just like, and obviously that was at a time when they hadn't kind of realized that they had this story of Raven, Tommy is never going to pin Raven until the very end of the feud, and they both wish it had never happened. I think Tommy Dreamer would be like, he would never ever pin him ever, because he probably knew he was going to come back at some point. And of course it's something that is so easy to overlook, because obviously you never mention it on TV. Mm-hmm. At this point, it's still, internet wrestling is still very much in its infancy.
Right.
And at the time it happened, the fans that went to that show wouldn't realize that would be significant. So it wouldn't be like if you were, 6 months into this feud and you're being told every week on TV, Raven never beats Dreamer, and they thought, well, we can just get away with it, Mountaintop Madness in Jimport, Pennsylvania, or have Tommy Dreamer win because nobody will find out. Because at that point, somebody would have gone straight online and went, oh my God, Tommy won this thing last night. And today there'd be, clips on the internet in 20 seconds. Whereas at this point, it was just kind of, lost to kind of the footnotes of old show results. And I remember I was always like desperately trying to kind of get confirmation of this. And I know I was really, really pleased when I managed to track down a show, a recording of the show, and confirm that, it wasn't a misprint or somebody misremembered result, but no, that is how it happened.
Yeah, that's very old school, right? That's the whole, Andre's undefeated, or Andre's never been slammed, or all these different things that when you watch TV, wrestling on TV, you just took it at its word because you didn't know any different, right? You didn't know, what happened in the territories, pre-TV, pre-internet. Yeah, so that is fascinating.
And it's also it's kind of an interesting subject of ECW, because I think it's probably the first promotion of that size that was running as eventually a full-time operation, kind of a place where people wrestled full-time. Where certainly once you get to about 95, 96, with the deal with Rob Feinstein at RF Video, it's one of the very few promotions where pretty much every ECW match at every spot show was recorded, is on video, exists in video form. Of course, now, AEW, every moment of AEW is available on tape. There was like kind of one house show that wasn't recorded. They clearly recorded it themselves. People took lots of clips. But if you go back, you think how many thousands of, WWF matches, or like, Smoky Mountain, I guess, recorded a lot of shows, but the idea that like every match would actually be there and you could go back and kind of see, and a lot of people have, went back and watched a lot of the house shows, and then you'll get things where you get a different perspective on it. So you'll get people who have looked for all the shows in sort of 99, 2000, and the memory of everyone at the time is that Just Incredible being kind of a long-term champion was, ridiculous idea of, the classic sign that the promotion is dying. And people who've kind of seen it all in the context, saying how, they kind of really enjoyed his run on the house shows as a champion, that he was having, credible, so to speak, main event matches.
Yeah. So mentioning in that same vein, when you did the research, when you went back and looked through this stuff, and as you were writing, is there someone in like that instance where you gained a whole new appreciation that maybe before you weren't necessarily a fan of, necessarily understood their value to the company, but is there someone maybe that jumped out of, hey, I kind of overlooked that as a fan watching ECW, and he was pretty impactful?
I'm not sure anyone really stands out, because certainly up to about 1997, I was so avidly, a viewer of the tapes. I mean, a couple of times, me and a friend, my parents had gone away. We were sort of teenagers at the time. We were had the house to myself for a few days. Now, this is where, American high school video movies tell you that this is where you have a big wild, keg party, you invite loads of women over. Of course, what we did was sit down and watch 48 hours of ECW TV in one weekend, which I don't recommend because, you end up kind of suspending your disbelief just through, losing any rational sleep and rational ability to see your own mind. And, you see the same commercials 20 times an hour for 48 hours is quite a crazy thing. But yes, I think I kind of already had kind of a good idea of kind of people, and maybe kind of the people like the Juventud and the Rey Mysterio as to how they kind of really their stuff stands up. And a lot of the matches are not designed to stand up over time because they were designed to be sort of kind of great stuff at the time. And what more I think really holds up is the TV, not so much, in ring quality or because it's got the violence or because it's got music, but the fact that the ECW TV, the original before CNN syndicated show, was a different format every week. And you're so used now to, you can take pretty much any episode of Raw or SmackDown from the last 15 years, and it's going to be, it may have a different set, it may have different colors, may have different announcers, but the basic concepts of the show, that it's 2 hours, it's presented either live or recorded as live, it's a 2-hour continuous kind of show. It's a matches, in-ring promos, backstage promos, matches, in-ring promos, always, a main event at the end of the show. Very much kind of the same concept. The ECW TV would be completely different every week. Some weeks it would be, an entire show long match. Some weeks it would be sort of a clip show. You might have one week it would be from 3 different events kind of packaged together. And obviously in hindsight, you realize a lot of that was to do with, they went and recorded with stuff, how good quality is it? Is it going to work in its kind of unedited form? Are we going to have to cut it down to a 3-minute music video and make the Eliminators look like the greatest team in the history of wrestling? Or is it going to be like a Guerrero Malenko where we're going to make the whole show built around them, start off with interviews with them, show their final match, show the post-match scenes, and kind of make that a show? And it's just, you never knew what you want to get, and it wasn't predictable.
Yeah, I've here lately I've been watching quite a bit of like 97, 98 ECW, and 2 things that have jumped at me one is the just incredible, like you mentioned. And while later, when he was shot, I remember at the time thinking, why is this guy champ? I don't get just incredible. But then when I go back and watch this 97, 98, from the moment he came in, man, they were pushing the hell out of him. He was injuring guys, and winning virtually everything. He was all over the TV, and so it's like they really saw potential in him, I guess, building him right from the get go. So there's that, and then it's like I forgot how over at that period Al Snow had gotten with the whole head thing, and or at least how much they portrayed it on TV and made us feel that. I mean, obviously the crowd responded, but it's remarkable. I just forgot that, right? I remember, Al Snow in WWE with the head thing and thinking, okay, whatever. But man, it really caught on in ECW more than I recalled.
Yeah, I remember thinking that was kind of a sign that as they were kind of growing bigger, that the sort of the crowds and the product was changing a bit. Because obviously I think there would be a time where if you said, Al Snow's really going to get over, he's going to be a really popular star and he's going to main event a pay-per-view, you would be assuming, oh, wow, so it's going to be like 25 minutes of Al Snow and like, a Shane Douglas or, Taz or someone. They're going to have kind of a cross between, a Japanese star and a kind of an American mat star, maybe a bit of high flying. And what you actually got was a 4.5-minute match in a ring, but one side of it being taped off because it had a big hole in it from Taz and Bigelow going through it. and the other half of the ring would be entirely full of styrofoam heads, you start to think, okay, something's changed here.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of the going to a bigger audience, was the get the thing that kind of gets over, that becomes familiar. People want to see something familiar, and you kind of burn through it as quick as you can. You kind of, at some point it's going to run its course, and like the crowd are going to get past it. But you don't drag it out. You kind of strike while the iron's hot.
Yeah, I agree. So if you were writing this same book now, beginning this project now, with the same hindsight, right, with the same knowledge that you have of what you did before, what would you do differently, right? Because you'd obviously have a lot more tools now, right? Like you said, you talked about the interviews. It's so much easier, regardless of where you are, to do an interview now, to conduct an interview, just like you and I are doing now. And there's so much more access, digitized, records and things online now than there was, we're talking 20 years ago. So what kind of things would you do now in doing this project?
I think so. So doing it now, interviewing wrestlers would be very different. That's now something I've got a lot of experience from one of my other projects, and eventually turned into a book, which was writing for Fighting Spirit magazine in the UK, which is another newsstand magazine. Mm-hmm. And we'd have a monthly feature interviewing old wrestlers from the TV era in Britain, which goes up to about 1988 and goes back to the mid 50s. And that's, really learned a lot about interviewing there, because a lot of the times it was wrestlers who were still kind of in the mindset of, you don't speak to people about the inner workings of a business. So you'd have to kind of learn a lot of skills of sounding out, kind of working out from them what you were going to get from what they were comfortable talking about. So one of the things I would always do would ask for the question, when did you start to feel comfortable in the ring? Which in itself is not always going to get you, a fantastic answer. It's going to be the best piece of your interview. But the way they answer that tells you kind of a lot about how they're sort of responding. So, if they go, oh, well, I was really, really nervous, but I was on with, Mick Manage, the top star, and he gave me a lot. He took care of me in the ring and made me look good because he was confident he was going to win and, didn't step on me. Is a very different answer to they go, oh, I was, I had no problems at all. I knew I was going to win straight away. And, I had a challenge from this guy, but I broke his arm and beat him in, 3 rounds. So I knew I was great. It's going to be kind of a very different, tough interview. So I think writing the book now, because this, wrestling history is so well documented, and so many people have told these stories. I think it would be one way would be to let's concentrate on kind of the human aspects and kind of get the stories of the different people on it. Of what did ECW mean to them? How did it affect kind of their life and their career? How would things have been different without it? I think the other way would be kind of much more explicitly exploring how it influenced what came afterwards, how it affected kind of the online wrestling community, the brand loyalty of different promotions. Obviously, the influence on Tony Khan, having been a fan going to those shows, and Paul Heyman having come in and become sort of such a big part of WWE. And really kind of interesting in what survived, what approaches survived, and what bits sort of died out and isn't so influential anymore.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: as a fan, what is your favorite year of ECW? Year or a couple of years of ECW?
So it would be kind of a tie for two different reasons. So it would be 1995 for story, 1996 for the in-ring. In 1995 was when you had kind of, I think it was the peak of having so many different stories, but all kind of like kind of well booked, intricate stories in their own right. But the thing with ECW as compared to other promotions at the time was that the storylines would intermingle. So, if you were in WWF in, 1995, 1996, these two wrestlers would have a beef, and for the next 3 months, they would be beating other, lower wrestlers, winning squash matches, talking about how they were going to go after each other, and they would have no interaction whatsoever with the next two wrestlers who had their own beef. Whereas with ECW, it was always everything kind of merged into each other, and you'd have quite often they would do like the start of a show. They would start off interviewing another wrestler. Somebody else would come in as they were leaving. It would bleed over into the next match. The classic example of that is the 1997 WrestlePalooza, where you've got the Tommy Dreamer Raven match, which kind of ends with the run-in, I think it's from Jerry Lawler, which sets up the Sabu Taz rematch, which ends up with Shane Douglas coming out for the challenge and Taz winning it. And you've had sort of 45 straight minutes of half a dozen different feuds all merging into each other and like making this kind of coherent narrative. 95 was where so much of that, and the absolute classic is the Pitbulls against Raven and Richards best of three falls double dog collar match, which also has is Dreamer going to get his first pin on Raven, and then you've got referee Ben Alfonso, who's been causing trouble all year, and then 911 comes out and he's been chokeslamming everyone. He finally gets to chokeslam Bill Alfonso, and it's just all these things merging together in complete chaos. And you get I had friends at university who would borrow that tape and they'd watch it, and they'd never seen pretty much any wrestling before, and they kind of they could watch it and enjoy it just on its own merits. But if you'd been watching the TV for sort of 6 months beforehand, it was like all of these storylines kind of merging together.
Yeah. I 96 is probably my favorite year, and but I think everything holds. There's a little something there typically in each year. So we mentioned earlier, we talked about Slamthology earlier. You mentioned briefly the Have a Good Week till next week about the British wrestlers of the TV era. You also wrote a book called Pure Odyssey, which was kind of about your journey to the Japan, and much of the same like of those chapters in Slamthology. Excuse me. Do you have any plans for any more books? Is there another project on the horizon?
So nothing at the moment. I'm always kind of interested in possible topics, looking maybe at the idea of whether I would sort of pitch something to a traditional publisher, where they would sort of pay an upfront fee to put a topic. Say Fighting Spirit magazine closed a few years ago. Unfortunately, it's just the print publishing was no longer really viable with the cost of paper publishing going up, the advertising market going down. At the time, WWE TV ratings were really slumping, so there was kind of the publishers had this kind of fear that it's going to affect the interest in the magazine. But yeah, kind of always kind of thinking on the topic of what would make an interesting topic for another book. So always open to ideas.
Well, very good. Hopefully we'll see some more work from you in the future. Like I said, I enjoy your books. Like I said, I've read the ECW book. I've read the British TV book. Slamthology, I haven't actually read it yet, but it's one that I want to dive into. So I am a fan of your work. So hopefully we get to see more of you in the future. You mentioned that you're looking for next projects. You're always active and doing things. Is there a way that fans can follow you online? What's the easiest way for them to follow you so they can know if something does pop up or arise?
So two ways. I'm on the X, for former Twitter, as just John Lister, JOHNLISTER. You can also check out my book review blog, which is prowrestlingbooks.com. And there's also a page on there that has a list of all my books and links to where you can buy them online. So that's definitely the easiest way to check it out.
Yeah, well, there you go. Like I said, they're all easy to find. I believe you can pretty much most online, Amazon, everything else. I think you can still find your books. I think they're all out there.
They're all on Amazon in both print and Kindle, and I believe they're all part of the Kindle One unlimited lending library, which is like sort of the Netflix of ebooks, I guess. Yeah. It is, where you can pay a monthly fee, so they're all on there. And yeah, that's quite interesting, because rather than a flat fee, I get paid sort of a small amount as for each page somebody reads through. So I do know that there's one person in Japan who has a copy of Slamthology, and they're obviously enjoying it, but they don't want to rush it and they're taking their time. So every month I'll get Mr. So-and-so has read another 2 chapters. You've got another 11 yen coming. So I I don't know if that's going to be my pension plan, but
Yeah.
looking forward to it.
That is so. It's almost like you have this bond with this person in Japan that you have no idea what they are. That's it makes you wonder how's that happen? What's he doing? Where is he so busy that he just has trouble finding time? Is he just? I have
think
questions.
because it's Slamphology, it is the first half of it is the kind of pretty epic travel experiences. So as well as the ECW trip, we came back for a couple where we went much longer trips around the States. So we went to Memphis TV in its dying days. We went to what was at the time Terry Funk's retirement show, been to the Dallas Sportatorium. So they're quite fun. And the second half of it is a lot of shorter articles. I can certainly see how you read one of those at a time.
Yeah, that's intriguing. Thank you, John, for your time and coming on and talking to us about your research, your book on ECW, your fandom of ECW. Like I said, the book is called "Turning the Tables: The Story of Extreme Championship Wrestling." I would advise everybody, like we said, to visit John's sites, follow him on X, so that you can know what's going on. But go get a copy of this book if you do not have one already, and if you do, give it a reread. And go on Kindle Unlimited and just read a couple chapters every now and then, just so John knows you're out there. And but John, thank you for your time and joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Support This Is Extreme and buy the This Is Extreme shirt. Show the world that you are part of the revolution and that you support our podcast and the history of ECW. Go to tinyurl.com/ECWpod shirt and buy yours today.
All right, and we're back here on This Is Extreme. I am Dave Dynasty. Very big special thank you to John Lister for coming on and chatting with me. That was a great interview. Again, go look up John's book, buy yourself a copy. It's a fun read, lots of information in there, so go get one for yourself. Hey, I want to take a moment. I want to plug a couple other shows that I really enjoy. Of course, everybody knows all the talent, right, that out there that has podcasts that you can listen to, right? Rob Van Dam has a show. Francine has a show. Raven has a show. Blue Meanie has a show. Everybody knows about those. I also advise that you all go out and listen to Reliving the Extreme. It's a ECW watch-along show. I've mentioned them before. It's kind of the perfect companion podcast to what I do here, right? I like to interview talent. I like to talk to talent and talk about that side of it and get their memories and so on about it. The guys over at Reliving the Extreme, Nate and Aaron, and it also includes former ECW talent Chad Austin on that show. They're doing a watch along, right? They started at the beginning. They're watching along ECW TV and events and giving their chat analysis and everything else. They're good guys. It's a good show. And again, a perfect companion piece to what I do here. I also want to give a shout out to a kind of a new show, a new thing going on. For my buddy and former guest Chubby Dudley now has a podcast on YouTube called Chewing the Fat. And it's kind of like he's kind of interviewing a lot of talent. He's kind of starting from the beginning. A lot of the guys from the Eastern days and the Tri-State Wrestling Alliance days. He's had some good guests on there. It's a lot of fun. So go look him up on YouTube, subscribe to him, and check out his show as well. So once again, make sure you follow us on social media. Make sure you subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform. Make sure you go and order a shirt. Thank you guys for your support. Thank you for your listens. Thank you for all you do. If you're out there listening to the show, if you got a post about ECW, if you're going to post up a picture of your favorite memory, your favorite wrestler, your favorite piece of merchandise, whatever it might be, make sure you tag us in it. We'd love to see that. We want to see all the extreme action going out there on social media. But give us feedback. If you're listening to the show, let us know, man. Give us a shout out online. Just tag us in it. We love the response and the feedback. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of This Is Extreme. I am Dave Dynasty. This is Extreme, the ECW History Podcast. So in 2 weeks, we'll be back. And until then, wherever you go, whatever you do, be good, be safe, and always keep it extreme.